Hello and welcome back to the Sydney Dialogue, a world first, a summit for emerging, critical and cyber technologies. Our next session is Social Reset, a new compact between technology and government. As social media has matured, our information environment has come under growing strain, with state and non-state actors actively manipulating these new public squares, threatening the stability of democratic systems everywhere. But the evolving dynamic of antagonism between governments and social media platforms is inhibiting the type of collaboration needed to overcome this challenge. Can technology platforms and legislators reset their relationships to build online ecosystems that support free societies? Our host for this session is the convener of the Sydney Dialogue and a research director at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Fergus Hanson. He is the author of Internet Wars, has been a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution and a professional Fulbright scholar at Georgetown University. He has worked for the UN as a program director at the Lowy Institute and served as a diplomat at the Australian Embassy in The Hague. He led the establishment of the Freedom Fund in London and the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery in Washington, DC. Before I hand over to Fergus, I'd like to remind everyone that you can join the public conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag TSD2021. Over to you, Fergus, and I hope you all enjoy the session.
Hello, and thank you all for joining us at the Sydney Dialogue for this session on Social Reset, a new compact between technology and government. I'm Fergus Hanson, Director of the International Cyber Policy Centre at ASPI and convener of the Sydney Dialogue. It's a great honour to be speaking with such an eminent panel today. From various corners of the earth, thank you all for joining us. Let me start by introducing our panel. Firstly, we have Ressa, CEO of Rappler and Nobel Prize laureate. A journalist of 35 years, Maria co-founded Rappler in 2012, the top digital-only news site that is leading the fight for press freedom in the Philippines. In October this year, Maria was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts to safeguard freedom of expression in the Philippines. Congratulations, Maria. Next, we have Kent Walker, Senior Vice President of Global Affairs at Google. Kent oversees Google's work on legal affairs, public policy, trust and safety, compliance, responsible innovation, and philanthropy. Also on our panel is Dr. Zeynep Tufekci. Zeynep is an Associate Professor in the School of Information and Library Science at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's also a contributing opinion writer at The Atlantic and The New York Times, and a Faculty Associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. And finally, we have Vijaya Gadde, Head of Legal Policy and Trust at Twitter. Vijaya is Twitter's top lawyer and oversees the company's content moderation decisions. Now, I wanted to get straight into the questions and pose to each of you this question of what are some of the big ideas for governments and technology platforms to reset their relationship? And maybe I can start with you, Vijaya.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I think we have great examples of this actually having worked well in the past that we can build on. But I think just taking a step back, one of the things I would do is make sure that we're all focused on the long term and the big picture here, which is I think we all share an interest in a global, free and open internet that is secure and safe for people to use. And you're right, when you say there's a lack of trust that exists with respect to online services as well as with governments. And I think we have a real opportunity to rebuild trust, starting with greater transparency. I think the government has a role to play here, but so do the platforms. We can have open standards that provide far, far greater transparency, but also interoperability and competition. So I think that we can really focus on this from a transparency perspective. You can have meaningful access to information, how platforms are working, what decisions they're making, and why. And providing that transparency is only going to build trust with the users that we all care about.
Great, thank you. Maria, could I turn to you? What are some of the big ideas that we could take forward to reset this relationship?
Uh, my gosh, I'll give three, and I will say, there are better players than others in the platform, in the technology world. I think the first to pick up from what was said is, a radical transparency. And that radical transparency should move away from where the public discussion has been, which is content moderation, and move upstream to where the design of the platform actually introduces. I've started calling it the virus of lies in the information ecosystem. So that would be that's the second one. And I would think the third one is that, and this is from ASEAN, this concept of enlightened self-interest. I will say it didn't work so well for ASEAN, but I'm hoping that with kind of a voluntary transparency, radical transparency, the fact that I don't think any of us, not any of the tech platforms, nor anyone living in a democracy would want to see the status quo continue. I agree that we should be looking at the long term, but the short term, right now, the immediate now is untenable, and we need to find the solution now, medium term and long term.
Great, thank you so much. Kent, could I pass to you?
Sure. Let me build on those comments, which I agree with. I think there's a need for a balance between responsible innovation on the one side for companies and sensible regulation from governments. It's important to remember that technology has been a huge force for good over the last decades and centuries, raising global living standards and bringing over 1 billion people out of extreme poverty. But at the same time, there's new social challenges that we have to work together to address. As Vijaya suggested, there are examples of ways that has happened in the past. The Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, the Christchurch call led by Prime Minister Ardern, increasingly the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership are letting companies come together, exchange best practices, establish norms in the sector that have been very helpful, because any law, no matter how well drafted, is going to have a hard time extending to give detailed answers to the millions of different content moderation questions or even product design questions that various platforms deal with every day. So that notion of a balanced approach where transparency is absolutely a part of it, has to be thoughtful transparency so that we don't inadvertently empower bad actors and let them game systems in bad ways, but also promoting new norms and best practice that will extend to a variety of different platforms out there. YouTube has 70 pages of community guidelines. Google Search has 150 pages of rater guidelines. Those are public documents, and I think making those public, those kinds of approaches public, actually leads to better conversations about where should we draw some of the lines in these areas.
Wonderful, thank you. And Zeynep, could I just get your thoughts?
So I think, so to start with, all these technologies, historically too, it's created a lot of disruption, right? We didn't get, from printing press to beautiful books. We had the 30-year wars and all sorts of other disruptions. So it's not the first time that you have the public sphere being radically altered by technologies. In fact, what we would consider sort of the status quo ante for our generation, the post-World War II era, was a response by a very, very scared world to what had happened in the past, not just the 2 world wars, but essentially maybe the 100 years before that, where we had come within like a hair of destroying the world. We had the horror of the Holocaust, we had the nuclear weapons, we had a realization that rise of fascism and like back-to-back global wars was clearly not working out for anybody. And we had a major restructuring of the public sphere. So what you think of modern journalism is a post-World War II consensus and a very deliberate engineering of the public sphere. And before that, you had a lot of things. Now we are kind of rediscovering the sort of the yellow journalism, the partisanship, the sensationalism, all of those things. The reason I say this is that this is not the first time the world is at this kind of turning point. Because sometimes it seems like, oh, there's nothing we can do. I'm kind of like, actually, we've turned around more difficult situations. Now, the second thing that the big idea I keep bringing back on the table whenever I can is that it's a matter of aligning incentives. It means aligning incentives between what we as societies want to happen and how these companies essentially can operate and make money. To give an example, like Google search wants you to find something and be on your merry way. And so if there's content farms ruining search, Google itself goes after content farms without needing to be legislated because it's ruining the product for what they want it to do. The way they make money and me are kind of on the same page that we don't want that content farm that's going to trick me. Whereas, say, YouTube or Twitter or Facebook have a business model that wants to increase engagement and keep me there. And there, I don't think the incentives are properly aligned there. And trying to micromanage the who's going to get platformed or deplatformed and where's that line is super messy, because I'm not even sure it's the tech company's place to draw those lines. And I'm not even sure there's other authorities to draw those lines that we can trust either. That's the other part of society that's not functioning well. Like, who's to say what's health misinformation? Like, it's who's to say? It's really complicated. So the real sort of long-term way forward for me is the way the companies make money and the way they operate and the sanctions they face being aligned with a publicly agreed vision of what a healthy public sphere would look like. Now, of course, we're not going to have a super duper 100% healthy, but at least there's going to be some goal that we're going to fail from, that we're working towards together. And right now, I feel like some parts of the companies work with us because, like, if brands are freaked out by some certain kinds of content, yeah, they go after that because the incentives are aligned. Whereas things like what Maria was talking about with certain kinds of harassment and misinformation, they do sometimes do something, but if it's if it's in Sri Lanka, it doesn't get a lot of attention, right? It might get some attention in the US or not because the incentives are not aligned. It's just an expense and a PR issue rather than something that disrupts the company's own interests. And for me, that's the long term. We have to align interests, and that's how we get out of what is essentially a fairly big historic transition in hopefully without another 30-year war or anything like that to scare us straight.
Well, maybe I can just riff off that point about aligning incentives. I mean, we spent a lot of time focusing on the challenges here and what's not going well, but I'm wondering whether there are some examples that we could look at where there are some good signs of collaboration and where the relationship is working well. And Vijaya, I just had a question maybe for you initially is the example of the US National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, is that a model that we could look to of good collaboration where you have companies reporting to an NGO and government providing this sort of stick that makes all the collaboration work? Is that a model that works in your view? Is that something that we could, expand that type of model?
I do think that's a good model. I think it's a pretty high quality model that has seen a lot of benefits to people. And it's one that we think can be expanded. But beyond that, I'd like to say, I do think that some of the self-regulatory models have worked really well. Kent mentioned a few of them, whether it's GiveCT or the Christchurch call. I think what I see here is that we have to sit down and talk about this because each of these things has enormous challenges. And even something like GiveCT is not as simple as it sounds, right? Like, it sounds great that we can all collaborate and share information around emerging threats with respect to terrorism. We all want to do that. None of us want this type of content on our platforms. But how we define that, how we use that information, what we share transparently with the public, these are important concepts that we all need to sit down and acknowledge and talk about. And I think what we often see is that it's much easier to put these things out there as ideas, but then the detailed work takes a long amount of time. And that's what we're seeing with GiveCT, right? Is like, this is not a one and done thing. We've started this years ago. It's getting better over time, but it's not going to be something that results, unfortunately, in immediate impact as quick as we would all want, I would say.
Great. And Ken, I was just going to throw to you on a question. I mean, you put out this op-ed recently in the Boston Globe where you said that democracies, unlike their geopolitical competitors, have a secret weapon, collective innovation. And I'm just wondering, is collective innovation a potential solution here? Could you envisage a world where a group of like-minded democratic governments work with companies like Google to find solutions to these problems? Is that where the West is going to win in this space? Is that a future way forward?
Absolutely. We're very optimistic about the progress that's being made. In the last week or so, you saw the G7, the G20 starting to come together and talking about the importance of human rights, access to information, free expression online. Having those kinds of international norms is extraordinarily important. You've also seen individual governments or regions come together on various codes of practice, whether it's the EU code on hate speech or the ASPI process, or in Australia, the code of practice on misinformation and disinformation. Those are the piece parts of a regulatory system, an international set of norms and standards starting to come together in a really productive way. There's a role for the private sector, there's a role for the public sector in trying to help define those norms. It's tricky because there is a slippery slope. You can get into authoritarian countries trying to exploit those sorts of approaches for their own purposes, and that you go too far down the slope and you're into censorship and violations of human rights in ways that are problematic for all of us. But I think we've taken a number of very constructive steps, and we're hoping for more progress in the next few years.
I wanted to turn now to how we balance free speech with some of the challenges faced by fragile democracies. And I'm wondering, could we have a different versions of platforms for fragile democracies and fully fledged democracies, whereby, for example, in fragile democracies, you might have things like virality might be slowed down a little bit. And Maria, you've been at the absolute coalface of some of these challenges. I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit in the beginning, whether you see, is that a model we could look at, a different version of platforms for different societies?
I have very mixed feelings about this because I will sound the alarm very much like, and I feel like I've been doing this for 5 years, so bear with me, please. I'll pick up from Zeynep. There's something fundamentally wrong with our information ecosystem because the platforms that deliver the facts are actually biased against the facts. So the world's largest delivery platform for news is Facebook, right? So, I mean, and social media in general has become a behavior modification system. So I'm going to go back to that. Zeynep talked about post-World War II. The world came up with a radical new concept for how to deal with preventing another atom bomb or another World War III, right? And I think that's how radical we need to think right now. And, the Nobel Committee actually kind of signaled that by giving it to journalists, because the last time journalists got this prize was in 1936, and he didn't get to go to get the prize. He languished in a Nazi concentration camp. So, look, I guess I don't think that there is an easy answer or that you can actually say weak democracy, strong democracy, because what the technology platforms have proven is that humanity actually has a lot more in common, i.e. our biology, and that it is very easy to manipulate our biology, our thinking fast system. And that the process of thinking, of writing, of journalism, of democracy, of a shared reality, of trying to find a solution to COVID or climate change, all of these things are thinking slow. And what happens after you tear apart that shared reality? I don't think it's as easy as, sorry, both tech guys, I don't think it's that easy. I think it requires a fundamental shift that requires a multilateral solution. And let's use that phrase that Shoshana Zuboff used, surveillance capitalism. It requires radical shift in how our personal data, how models are created through machine learning, how AI is generating GPT-3, which is this, that it can now write and think like a human, word by word, right? This will change everything even more. So we need to put these guardrails in place now, and we can't just say it's going to be more of the same. So look, I wish it was as easy as saying, hey, look, if you're in the Philippines, your World Press Freedom Index is lower, or if you're in Venezuela, you get a different one that has more guardrails in place. I don't think it's that simple. I think what the tech platforms have shown is exactly how easy it is to use technology to manipulate human biology. You know, the upside of all of what's happened in the last 5 years is that human beings from different countries and different cultures around the world actually have a lot more in common than we have differences. That seems like it's the opposite lesson that we've learned, but the very same platforms are able to manipulate us in the very same ways, right? And regardless of culture. So our biology is actually very, very vulnerable to this technology. So it's the very design of the technology and the way it can insidiously manipulate people in the same way that like CRISPR technology, guardrails were put in place very quickly in the West. This is what we failed to do collectively on the information technology. And, you know, I became a journalist because I knew that information is power. That leads to justice. That leads to the quality of your democracy. That leads to the facts. So, you know, I guess as we get more technology coming out, AI generated photos, GPT-3 that has over 175 billion parameters. It is thinking word for word faster than any human being ever can. And you are not going to be able to get AI to fix the problems that human beings have created. So I think, you know, go back. We need to put those guardrails in place. There's no easy solution except to go back to what Zeynep said, which is post-World War II. We didn't want World War III with atom bombs. That has already happened in our information ecosystem. It is manipulating our minds insidiously, creating alternate realities, making it impossible for us to think slow at a time when we need to solve existential problems. Thinking fast, being manipulated by the technology insidiously in a business model that's been dubbed surveillance capitalism, how much of our private thoughts can now be inferred through the data we put in. How much of that is ours? How much of that is tech's? And how much of it should be manipulated for profit?
Thank you so much, Maria. Vijaya, I was wondering if I could turn to you about this idea of, you know, balancing, free speech with some of the challenges faced by fragile democracies. Is there an option to adjust the platforms for different environments? What's your thoughts on that?
I also think that is easier said than done. I think in all of these cases, there's this balance or this dance that we do between free expression, privacy, safety. And I don't think that there's a objective standard that we could use that would tell us exactly where we end up in any given country or any given situation. So I don't know how we would do that effectively. And I worry that even that requires us to make some arbitrary designations that we aren't capable of making at a micro level on content moderation, and then being asked to make that at some sort of macro designation level also feels very uncomfortable to me. So I don't know that that's the solution. I do think that there are other things that we need to think about, and I totally appreciate Maria's point on how fast information is moving and the spread of that information and what it's doing to people. But I think we also have to think about this from the perspective of, do we give people enough options? Do we give them enough information? Do we try to slow things down in certain instances? You know, we piloted a bunch of things at Twitter. We call them nudges, which are just quick little pop-ups before you're tweeting information, before you're retweeting an article. Did you actually read this article? Or a quick little pop-up, this was considered misleading by certain groups. Are you sure you want to retweet this? This potentially could be viewed as harassment or the use of slurs in this language. Is this really what you want to do? And we've actually had remarkable incidents of reducing harm on the platform because of those little speed bumps that we're putting in place. So those are the types of things that I want to encourage platforms to do and experiment with, because if the solutions were easy here, I think we would have found them and we would have implemented them. So we have to learn, we have to iterate, and we have to try radically new things here to help stem some of these problems we're seeing.
Maybe I could just ask you a quick chaser on that. One of the initiatives that Twitter took as well was to ban all political advertising 2 years ago. And I think the founder of Twitter said, we believe political message reach should be earned, not bought. I was just wondering whether you could reflect on the impact that policy has had and whether that offers a pathway to restoring the information environment and any other initiatives you might have in the works.
Yeah, I think, for us, that was a real moment of acknowledging how our promoted products can supercharge information and really saying in that moment, like, this is an area where we think people should not be allowed to spread information, certainly in the context of information that none of us can verify at the speed at which it was happening in an election context. So we made that decision. I think that also opened our eyes to transparency around here. Why did we make these decisions? What else are we thinking about here? And that we follow that decision with a bunch of state labeling, whether it's labeling government accounts so people understand when they're seeing information, it's coming from a government affiliated account, labeling state media. And again, we had to make some determinations about who's state media, who's controlled by a state. But this is all in this context of providing more information, not less. So context can really play a role in how people are interpreting and analyzing where they're getting their information from.
Zeynep, maybe I could turn to you on this topic of the balancing of free speech with how to support fragile democracies.
So I want to say, I don't like the designation because I think it's the wrong way to think about it. My first piece on this, when I was a nobody knew me assistant professor, I wrote a piece for the New York Times. It was my very first op-ed. I didn't even know how I got in. About the Obama administration using Facebook for targeting. And they were doing some limited for our world. It's just 10 years ago. Some sort of algorithmic ranking and trying to analyze voters. And I try to just say, this is how you get epistemic fracture. You get these very efficient targeting. And of course, we had, cable TV advertised here, advertised there. So we had some precedent for that kind of fracturing. But now we were fracturing phone by phone, screen by screen, which is a different kind of epistemic fracturing, which you can do partly because now you have computational power to target people at the level of the person, and you have their data to try to work with, and then you have all sorts of things. I wrote this very mild thing, but I thought, I wanted ad transparency. I thought it's not really a great idea to sort of have this fractured targeting without any transparency into it. I had some we didn't have the algorithmic feed even almost, or not, I don't remember. Well, anyway, everybody in the Obama world really got mad at me who spoke to me essentially. And there was an op-ed published the next week by Obama's data director called my piece a malarkey, and I'm quoting. And I said, guys, gals, this is a historically sort of this transition thing. You just got elected as president. You're in power. Put some guardrails here. Think about this. And they said to me, many of them, that, as an advanced democracy and as a great campaign and a great president and so much technology, this technology would only empower the good guys, which of course they meant themselves, and that my concerns were was I against the first Black president's reelection or something? I'm like, this is not, I'm just talking about there's a bigger thing here. You're not as invulnerable as you think. And then I wrote a book that was very much based on some of my experiences and an analysis on more authoritarian states, including, I think, some Philippines. And I wrote it and I thought, okay, nobody's going to read this either. And then Trump got elected. So the idea that we in the West are somehow immune and that we need to coddle the poorer democracies, that's not true. If anything, they need more, I think, hands off in terms of when it comes to free speech, because very often what's illegal there may well be the truth, right? So you can't, it's here, what's illegal here may really have something wrong with it, whereas in the context of an authoritarian setting, what the government considers illegal in terms of speech might exactly be what that place needs in terms of sort of looking at from a thing. So I find that, like, if I was going to be hands off in one part of the world, that would be more my leaning. The thing I keep going back to that is crucial to me is this virality and engagement thing that keeps getting sort of walked around, because it's easier to try to say, who should we kick off the platform? It's harder to think about how are we shifting the whole information ecology by design. And I don't mean just the like button, I don't mean the retweet, I don't mean the quote, I don't mean the recommendation, I mean all of it. Because if you think of it, like my analogy to this, it's like food, and this is going to go back to what Maria's saying, we're just kind of playing off each other here. If you have humans who evolved under conditions of hunger, and then you build a cafeteria, the business model of which is to keep you there. That cafeteria is going to serve you chips, ice cream, in like one after the other. It doesn't really matter. You can say, this ice cream is really terrible, I'm going to kick this one off. You're going to shift that ecology of what people eat, because you've taken a very human vulnerability, which is we've evolved under hunger, and you've monetized it using an automated cafeteria. So in some sense, our information environment is not incentivized. And it's not because the people working in these technologies aren't great or smart or not well-meaning. I have so many friends there, and I have a lot of smart people there. It's that if you don't find a way, and that's where it requires the politics, because they can't find that way themselves either, because who died and made them kings and queens to begin with, right? It has to be something that we ask them to do, rather than we don't tell them what to do and then just get mad at them or try to sort of play the referee and hope they help our side now or something like that. So we as society need to sort of figure out a way to understand what that incentive system would look like that we agree on to some degree. And then we go to these companies and say, okay, here are the rules that we would like this to work. And then it'll get to everything else people are talking about here, which is that it's going to be really complicated. It's going to be messy. You're going to have to iterate. The things you try may or may not work the first time. But we don't even have some sensible agreement on how would we build a healthy public sphere given what we currently have as technology and given what we have as political environment. And I think that focus on free speech is kind of misses the point, because it's more like the free speech bit is like, who should we kick off the platform? And I don't like that conversation. It's not like, why should, with all due respect, like why should Vijaya have to decide that? And it should be we should have guidance for these companies to say, this is where these lines are, in a way that makes sense, so they can fall back on it rather than just trying to muddle through each example, and also at the scale of billions, which isn't really possible. So that's kind of where I keep thinking, like incentive alignment that comes from society, and then we work with everybody around to try to make it work to the best of our ability.
Thank you. Kent, do you have thoughts on this?
Yes, I think it's a profound question. Zeynep talked about the printing press. You could as well go to the post office or radio and television or rap lyrics and video games. Every time we have these new communications tools, there are new changes to law and social norms that are important to address the challenges. Even the example of CRISPR came out of the work that was done at the Asilomar conference in California, where there were a variety of genetic engineers who came together to set norms for that community as to what kind of research was appropriate and not. And then when the CRISPR issues came up, they could go back to that and say, wait a second, we have actually agreement as a scientific community. So I think you're seeing a rapid evolution of norms in this space. I do worry about, on the one side, make it harder for people to share their thoughts and concerns about things. But the other aspect to it is the level of granularity that you use. I'm not sure that different countries is the right way to do it. After all, who sets the rules for who's a fragile democracy and who's not, as some of the other panelists were mentioning? Instead, I think you need a finer grained analysis of these different situations. Is something likely to incite violence? We had a situation, the Las Vegas shooting a few years ago, where originally on YouTube, we saw people posting blatantly incorrect material, and that was rising to the top because there was nothing else. When people searched for Las Vegas shooter, there were no other results to show. We learned as a result of that to basically freeze the news shelf on YouTube. We have a 24/7 desk that looks for dramatic events around the world. And when there is something like that, we basically won't return any answers until legitimate journalists have had an opportunity to fill that news void with credible content. Now, we're not a social media company, and the different platforms are different in different ways. In many ways, Google search has been an antidote to fake news. But we take these problems very seriously, and I think all of us have made significant progress in the last 5, 6, 7 years. For example, we talk about the notion of aligning incentives. On the long term, it's increasingly clear that better quality content builds up trust in platforms. Advertisers like it better, users like it better. We've, on YouTube, implemented the notion of 4 Rs to raise and reward good quality content and remove and reduce lower quality content. As a result of that, the use of the platform has gone up, not down. And there are a number of academic independent surveys that are supporting that direction. There are additional steps that we and others are exploring. The Twitter was mentioned as requiring previews before things are shared. I think that's an important step. We and others have been working on the notion of pre-bunking, trying to make accuracy more salient for people viewing content. And if your mindset is this true or not, you're actually less likely to automatically forward on the lower quality content. We've got to be careful because some of these changes can have counterintuitive effects. There was a rush to do fact-checking at one point. Sometimes fact-checking can be very valuable and kick in the system 2 thinking that Maria and Zeynep were talking about earlier. Sometimes it can actually provoke people to say, this thing is indicated to be false, and I want to find out more about that, and you actually see more people clicking on it. So we are in a new territory where our original instincts from a different environment, different information environment, may actually steer us wrong. But I think you're seeing a rapid evolution of the platforms, higher quality content, and a much more intentional and purposeful focus on this class of thing.
Great. Well, some of you touched on this in your answers, or at least hinted to it, but we've talked about balancing free speech. But how do we prevent regulation of platforms being used as an excuse to undermine democracy? And I'm wondering, is there a role for minilateral efforts where groups of states could work with platforms to agree key principles of regulation? And maybe I can start with you, Zeynep, on that one.
So, I mean, I want to say one thing, part of what we do wrong here is you can't regulate cars as if they were horseless carriages, right? So some of the fact checking bit, I was like, this is not going to really work because that's almost like a print era thing. It's like, the whole point isn't the way it works. So you can't regulate this. You can't regulate cars by removing the watering holes, right? It's a car. It's not something like that. So I think we still haven't grappled with something that Maria talked about in that, and we have tons of research on that. There's no way truth and factual stuff is going to be as engaging as the things that feed the tribalism. And I don't say tribalism as a bad thing. I say it as a human thing. Us versus them. For a social animal like us is the most core thing. It's good. It's in some ways we bond with family. We bond with we feel pride in our nation's accomplishments. If the Martians invaded, we'd probably finally unite. We celebrate the Olympics, right? So there's all these things that come from the bonding. But the other side of tribalism, and which is sort of the dark side of human history, is the them, right? There is the polarization. And as long as you are trying to, using surveillance and computation, these sort of machine learning systems to keep people on the platform, I find it hard to imagine how factual stuff can compete because it's more boring. It's just, there's no question about it. It's going to be more boring, and things that are designed to you dunk on other people, you argue, it's not an echo chamber, it's like yelling at each other. That's just going to be more engaging. So we keep going back to free speech, and I keep going back to how do we overcome the epistemic fracture. To me, is a more important question than who do you kick off the platform. I mean, I find in general, yes, the US First Amendment is a little sort of extreme by global standards, and I'm closer to it than most of the world. I'm not really completely, like, I don't think like that, not being, but nobody else has it, right? It's the thing. But even if you just take it as is, that's not even the biggest question. The question keeps coming back to, can you create a system in which people are incentivized to consume and do and socialize in a way that we as a society agree is healthier? Because it's also not right for the platforms to completely dictate this. So you keep asking about free speech, and I keep going back to free speech is a core human value that we can't just sort of turn over to platforms. And curbing free speech isn't necessarily where I think the nexus of challenges. It's not people opining good or bad, terrible or not. It's the way in which the ecology shifts and drowns out the other stuff, and then the epistemic fracture creates these alternate realities which stop being able to communicate with each other, both nationally and globally. Now, I'm not saying this to say this is easy. Like, this is a huge, major, historic, like nobody's going to have a magic wand. But I think we should stop thinking about it in 20th century terms, and think about the 21st century challenge that's really difficult and profound, but not really like fragile democracy or free speech, more like how do we get certain things to be powerful, and how do we counter some of the things that we unleash that are very human, that are very not new, but now we have them at this big scale, amplified and global.
Can I ask you, one of the your pieces of writing had this sort of quite a little bit depressing phrase or paragraph where you said, "Power always learns, and powerful tools always fall into its hands. This is a hard lesson of history, but a solid one. It is key to understanding how in 7 years digital technologies have gone from being hailed as tools of freedom and change to being blamed for upheavals in Western democracies." So I'm just wondering, at the heart of your writing and thinking on this, are you optimistic we'll find a pathway through, or is it inevitable that any platform will just be co-opted by autocrats?
I am absolutely optimistic. I know it sounds terrible, like in the middle of all of this, to say we're optimistic, because so I keep going back to the 1946, and there's an example I give. If in 1946, if you were betting with someone and you said what year do you think Germany will attack France again, and they'd be 1965 or to 73, give or take, you'd take that, you'd say, yeah, that's probably what's going to happen, right? We had hundreds of years of pretty terrible sort of reoccurring history. Well, instead, within the lifetime of people who'd been through 2 globally destructive world wars, we had borderless travel and, single currency. The European Union may not be perfect, but it's a staggering human achievement considering what it was trying to contain. And we also managed not to blow ourselves up yet with nuclear weapons. And there's all these other things that, and food safety. I mean, you can walk into a supermarket and if you get poison, it's a scandal. This really wasn't the way it was. When we first got mass food manufacturing in cities, the first thing we got was fake food, literally fake food. People would put lead and other heavy metals to make food look fresh and poison people, and they would use formaldehyde to embalm milk, right? Now you can walk into a supermarket almost anywhere, a little market, a tiny little thing in almost any corner of the continent, and you don't expect to get poisoned. These are big infrastructural things. The first Earth Day, you can't read the poster because the smog was so thick when they first marched in New York. This was in the 70s. You couldn't literally read their thing. So there's a lot of big problems we solved, and we don't realize how big a challenge they were because they have, for us, receded into the background, right? I think the pandemic kind of reminded us infectious diseases suck. relatively speaking, we've really gotten them under control compared to human history. So I feel like this is why it frustrates me so much, that compared to previous eras where we faced genuine, terrible, thorny challenges and kind of managed to do a lot of good forward, like, what do we got? Yes, we have a pandemic, but it's ending. We got the vaccines. We don't have, the world is not in fire. The companies that we're talking about, I don't know how much Google and Apple and I don't know about Twitter, but they have like hundreds of billions of dollars they're sitting on because they're so cash rich, which could be put to innovative uses in the space. Like, there's everything in place to try to address this compared to past periods where we've overcome deep challenges and not under these conditions. And look, it was great. We got tech tools through a pandemic. It would have really been terrible if we didn't have them, right? I don't even dislike these things. I'm a geek at heart. I would like them to function better, but I like these things. So I'm genuinely an optimist because I feel like the only thing missing is the political will. And the companies would resist. Whatever we came up with is like going to be a little uncomfortable for them. But honestly, the big ones now, the ones that are in the screens, they'll be the winners of whatever we stress test we put on them because they're the big ones. So I think there'd be some back and take and resistance and oh no and all of that, but we'd get through it and there'd be new forms of doing it. And then we'd all be happier because if the world falls apart into these epistemic fractures, as we found out, like having a first class ticket on the Titanic isn't that great. We need to like have it not sink. So I'm very critical, but the level of criticism is what an optimist does. Otherwise, like, why bother?
I love it. Thank you. Ken, I was wondering, could you offer some thoughts on how do we prevent regulation of platforms being used as an excuse to undermine democracy?
Your notion of the mini-lateral effort, I thought, was a powerful one. The Christchurch call we spoke about earlier is a great example of countries and companies coming together. I think there were ultimately 20 countries and a number of, pretty much all of the leading internet companies joined together with civil society and came in with a set of commitments that quickly and I think responsibly addressed the threat of terrorist content online. So there are very real examples of how we are getting better at this and coming into alignment. But the flip side is also very real. I realize that there's a desire to focus on some of the universal impact of platforms, but as the platforms wrestle with government demands, we are seeing a number of authoritarian states trying to use the opportunity to cut back on human rights, cut back on access to information. Freedom House recently issued a report that said more than 20 countries in the first half of this year alone have cut back on internet access or shut down the internet entirely. So we are constantly trying to figure out how to push the envelope without tearing through it entirely on a whole range of issues. And that is an area where an international democratic consensus would be very helpful. The companies are, at the end of the day, just companies. We're not in a position to push back against governments and government demands that we disagree with. We have to comply with the laws of the countries in which we do business. So having the international community, whether it's United Nations, G7, G20, or others, OECD, the transatlantic dialogues that are going on, I think that's a very important conversation as we set norms, not just nationally, but internationally. And at the end of the day, we are likewise optimists. We do want to partner with governments and with the NGOs, recognizing that there are tensions between competition and privacy, between competition and content moderation. But if we get this right, if we can actually land something that has broad-based support, that helps us build a stronger digital future for everyone. Google is now, let's say, I think we just had our 23rd birthday. We've grown up. We've come to appreciate the need for a balanced approach on these kinds of things. And we think there is a good middle ground where we can find a way to fight misinformation, deliver higher quality content, but also avoid the risk of censorship around the world.
Great. Maria, your thoughts on this?
Wow, I'm going to pull three different strands that they've all mentioned. So first, I think we need greater leadership from tech who have given us a little bit of, sometimes it's smoke and mirrors, like that free speech thing, that's a smoke and mirror. That's not the problem. It's over here when you should be looking over here. In the sense of, so strand one is, if it is the post-World War II, what is our Universal Declaration of Human Rights for the internet? And let's pull it up to the internet. We've talked about aligning incentives. Even journalism has frittered away because investigative journalism, a news group, is the entire process of a news organization that is expensive. And yet, the incentives for news organizations when you move it online is a page view. Right? There's no way a page view is going to be able to pay for this process that had worked as gatekeepers. So if you're going to tear that apart, what replaces it? And I guess I'll push again. We need to imagine a new paradigm for a global information ecosystem because, like Zeynep and Ken, I am very optimistic of what the world can be if we don't tear it apart right now, while the people who have the technical skills and the money to actually push it forward into a new realm. I think governments are starting to get it, but it's still, we're in content moderation. We're in old world vocabulary. We need to kick it up to what are the possibilities? I hate to say Camelot, what does the ideal world look like? What is our UN today? Sorry, I will shut up because I think, I don't know how we survived 5 years, but we did. And I'm still super optimistic. But if we don't take the right steps forward right now, then we descend further into the road to fascism. I mean, another historical moment could be the age of industrialization in the United States, right? Remember all of Carnegie, all of the sweatshops, all of the warnings that these huge companies were giving about if you regulate us. Well, the regulation happened and they became some of the biggest donors to the system of education or systems that they broke down. So that's the moment we're in. We need to imagine, we need to get rid of some of the profits, but when we build a better world, it will get better and you will make more profits. I think that's where we are.
I love that positive thought. Vijaya, I'll come to you, and I also want to get a couple of delegate submitted questions as well. So any thoughts you have on that? But I've also got this question that's been submitted. How will geopolitics alter government policy towards social media platforms? Will this change thinking on antitrust discussions? And will geopolitics drive greater collaboration among Western tech companies and democracies?
Great, thank you. Just on Maria's point, I also think that we need new standards. We need to think of this differently. And so often in these discussions, we think about it as content moderation as this blunt tool, keep it up, take it down. I mean, that's just not realistic for where the internet is going, how we're decentralizing things. We really need to look way past this binary system to what's possible. Think about algorithms, think about recommendation systems. How do we approach information gaps? How do we provide context? So I also agree, there's a lot of work for us all to do here, and we have to stop thinking about how we would have done this in the past and think about what we want this to look like in the future. And with respect to your second question, apologies, could you repeat that, please?
Just wondering, how will geopolitics alter government policy towards social media platforms? So is this geopolitical tension that rising, is that changing thinking, for example, on antitrust discussions? Is it going to drive Western tech companies closer to government? Is that going to be one of the fallouts from this increasing tension we're seeing in the international system?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, we're certainly, as Twitter, in a unique position. As much as I wish we had hundreds of billions of dollars, we're a relatively small player here. We're definitely seeing kind of how antitrust is playing a role in all of this. I think you all referenced, that in many instances, the large companies or the established companies are the ones that are going to benefit and be able to comply with regulations. And that's certainly something we need to think about to the extent we believe innovation has a role here. Do we want to keep the possibility for smaller new entrants here to be able to do something different, build a different type of platform, service a need within this public square that could be handled differently than we're doing it? So I think that's a really important point, and one that we'd love to see part of this discussion as we I think we're all open to this idea that we need to figure out a better solution, but how can we figure out that solution that also underpins a competitive dynamic with respect to innovation? Because I do think technology has a huge role to play in how we solve these challenges.
Great. We've got a couple more questions. So we had a question from Mia. Should government play a role in regulating how social media algorithms work and the kind of content they amplify? That is, should the state be able to look under the hood at how platforms are working instead of just creating rules about content? I don't know if anyone wanted to jump. Maria, your eyes signal.
Yeah, I think that's where the state should be, frankly. You know, it should be at the design, at the algorithmic design that amplifies, because what you choose to amplify is it's a freedom of reach issue, not a freedom of speech issue, right? So yes, absolutely at that point. Another example I think you can look at is, the building codes or how you regulate pharmaceutical companies are very, very different. You don't go down to the granular detail of each ingredient. It's almost like by going down into content moderation, it takes our attention away from the problem upstream. It is by design. What by design is it going to do to each of us as people, as groups, as emergent humanity? Because that is what these huge information systems are creating. It is, again, back to incentives. It is incentives are there for the worst of human nature, and it strips away the best of human nature.
Did anyone else?
The problem we have here, though, is the machine learning makes this like a black box to the companies too. So we have, like, that's what makes the challenge really profound. Like, how do you align the incentives is great, but if we make them turn over code, that code isn't going to tell us what that is going to do, which is the challenge, right? Because that's why what Maria was saying, and everybody else seems to be on the same page at least, is like you have to have forward thinking, because if you try to regulate it like a newspaper, like I want to see your editorial notes, well, you're not going to get that, because that's not what's under the hood here, which is challenging.
I think that's an important point. Just looking at Google alone, our algorithms for Google search changed. I think we made 2,500, 3,000 changes last year, so 5 or 6 changes a day, largely to deal with bad actors who are trying to game and exploit the algorithm. And so I think there's a role for transparency, but we need to think through, is it with sort of trusted government reviewers or other ways of keeping the bad actors from actually being able to reduce the quality of the search results you get, for example. It's a complicated area. And then the other challenge, of course, is once governments start to like the idea of being able to dictate how algorithms work, you can imagine lots of governments around the world having different things that they would like to have featured high in search results and depressing things that they didn't like people seeing in search results. So there is a real, not a theoretical, but a practical slippery slope problem here. We have seen actual instances in which democracies passed a law and authoritarian governments within weeks passed their own version of the law, which was not nearly as public interest. It didn't have public interest at the center.
Vijaya, did you have anything, or are we happy to move on?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I just don't think it's that simple to look in the hood. We try, even within our own companies, we try to understand how these algorithms are working and why they're having the results they are, and if making modifications. And I don't think it's simple. So beyond looking into the hood is understanding the outputs and inputs. Like, what is the data that we're using to train? And those are huge data sets that are proprietary in many instances. Like, there are other areas of transparency here that we can look at. And then lastly, one of the things we're going to be experimenting with is choice around algorithms. Is there a way that you could introduce some choice here that would give users more control over the systems that are recommending content to them.
We have only a minute left, but I just thought I'd ask one more question, which has come in from Salah. Is what are some of the challenges to achieving a reset, and what can government and social media companies do to overcome them? And I was just wondering if we could ask each of you just for one challenge and one way we can overcome it, just in a couple of sentences. Maybe Vijaya, I can start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge is understanding the details and the nuance and bringing people together who really understand technology, because this is such a critical component to being able to legislate effectively and to avoid, inadvertent missteps here. And obviously, our partnerships with civil society is hugely critical. And so often we think of this as bilateral between governments and platforms, but there's a whole other groups here that should be part of this process.
Great. Zeynep.
So I think if you want an obstacle to reset, it's thinking small. And I have to say, this is where I'm going to differ with my tech company friends, because they would prefer the tweaks. Whereas I think Maria and I are saying that you need to really rethink the incentives. And if we did that, what we would end up with would not be a minor transition. It would be a major transition. I feel like it would be possible and it would be doable. It would just not be easy or the preferred path, because no big company is like, all right, please upset my business model, right? That's not what they're going to do. But I think we need to think big, because if there were small hanging fruit, to be honest, I think the people on these screens would have, and they do that stuff. The problem is bigger than the small hanging fruit that these companies actually do go for and try to improve and have improved. And that's for me, the obstacle is let's think big, not tweaks.
Wonderful. Ken.
Sure. I think from my perspective, the biggest challenge is the complexity of the problem and the unintended consequences and second and third order impacts. Breaking a system, as Zeynep was saying, is working in many ways. Technology is delivering for billions of people around the world, helping us get through the pandemic, connecting us in positive ways, allowing the growth of the economy and millions of jobs around the world. There are significant issues to address here, but I think the notion of convening people in a thoughtful way, in the United States Congress at one point they said, send in the nerds. I think there's a value to sending in the nerds, the engineers who are actually working on these issues every day to think about how do we deal with the emerging challenges of artificial intelligence and quantum computing beyond that, which our lessons from 20 years ago really don't equip us well to understand, let alone think through what damage might we do as we're trying to solve one problem, potentially creating larger ones. I do think there are challenges that can be solved, and working together, we can make significant changes that keep the benefits of technology and minimize the challenges that we've seen.
Wonderful. And Maria?
Oh, so I agree to a degree with Ken, but I think unintended consequences, they're here. And I don't know about you, but the U.S. elections coming up, you guys are a little bit in trouble. You're going to be in as much trouble, maybe not as much as we are, but you're not out of the woods, because the incentives for the delivery platform of news actually has a thumb on the scale against news. So without the facts, we're not going to have a healthy democracy. And I guess to go back, and it's nothing against you, I guess I'm just saying that I love the fact that they moved fast and broke things. And now that it's broken, we can't move fast and iterate to get better. Twitter, thank you. Yes, you have been trying different things, but Zeynep and I have been riffing off, constitutional level thinking. It's like if the tech guys, building tech means you atomize things and you have to go down to the bricks that build it. If you're a journalist, you go the opposite way, which is, you go, meaning if you're a policymaker, you go top and you perfect it. A tech will come bottom up. And that's the way we've been addressing the problem. I think that we need to go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for the internet. Whatever we're living with in the real world, We need to create that in the virtual world. Even if it doesn't make as much money, it will be better for everyone in the long term. So when you think of legislation, let's move it away from these, you can see they're hot button issues for Zeynep. I mean, it's not a freedom of speech issue. Let's move it to where it needs to be.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very, very much for that. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I want to thank all four of our brilliant panelists for their contributions, and thank you to our Sydney Dialogue audience for tuning in. A reminder that all our sessions will be available for catch-up viewing on the website from next week. You can also continue the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag TSD2021. We now have a break for 1 hour until our next session, which is an address from India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. I hope to see you all back here again soon. Thank you so much.